Hello, and welcome to Right in Front of My Face, the podcast talking about big things happening right in front of us. I am your host, Shannon Hull, and it has been a haul, but here we are at the final episode of season 4. And in a lot of ways, it felt like I would never get here, but I did it. I am so proud of this, the last and final COVID pivot conversation. I think a part of the reason I struggled with getting this particular episode scheduled is because I knew I wanted to tackle the overturning of Roe V. Wade as the biggest COVID pivot, but I wasn't sure what angle to approach it from. Because my first angle is pure, unadulterated rage. I am just absolutely furious at what's happening to reproductive rights. And while I was spoiled in my adolescence knowing that my right to an abortion was real, the world my daughter now inhabits doesn't afford her that luxury. Should she move to a non-sanctuary state and have a miscarriage, what could possibly happen to her or to anyone living in poverty or without the means to travel for an abortion? So I've been stuck wallowing in what ifs and processing my own feelings, trying to figure out how to talk about this subject. The other thing I had to get over was my own fear of talking about abortion honestly. So many times I've patted my own feelings about political and personal topics on this show, but I simply cannot on this one. My decision to open up about being pro-choice, or rather pro-reproductive rights, we'll talk about this language distinction on the show, wasn't one I take lightly. I'm still concerned what people think about me. I don't want to offend anyone, but staying neutral on this issue simply is not an option. So here I am. I believe in my core as a Catholic woman that every person should have access to safe abortion. I believe it's a human right, and I believe without it, people all over the world will continue to be oppressed. So there you have it. The next question was, who should I bring on to talk about this with me? I considered lawyers, OBGYNs, but ultimately I wanted to find someone who could speak to exactly what we can do to give us tangible tools to become a part of a movement. I decided action was maybe a place we could use some education on, so I started researching policy advocates in Washington State. That landed me on the Pro-Choice Washington's website. They are the only agency in the state of Washington whose sole focus is on, and I quote, political and legislative advocacy for reproductive freedom in Washington State. We believe every person deserves equitable access to affordable, unbiased, quality abortion and reproductive health care within their community. The decision to overturn Roe v. Wade is done. We can't go back. And there is currently a federal abortion ban on the table in Washington, D.C., so policy is one of the only tools we have. But I don't think very many of us know what that means or how to apply ourselves to policy change. So those of you that know me will understand my next move. I picked up the phone to leave a voicemail pitch for the executive director of Pro-Choice Washington, Guarino. I remain one of the few humans who uses the phone app to actually talk. And in this case, it worked because Miss Guarino, much to my surprise, picked up her phone on the second ring. Once I got over my shock at hearing a human voice at the end of my cold call, Kia and I had an open conversation about what I was feeling and hearing, and I hung up knowing this was the person who could shed some light on how to move forward. Even 44 episodes in, I'm still humbled that individuals like Kia who have dedicated their lives to their work agree to come on and share their expertise with all of us. My hope for this episode is that you leave with a sense of what the truth is and get some tools to normalize the word abortion and the conversation that surrounds it. Reading the materials from Pro-Choice Washington honestly opened my eyes to the fact that we've all spent decades not realizing we were inadvertently buying into anti-abortion rhetoric, and we've let it cloud our vision. I learned so much from Kia, and I hope you do too. We need to stay vigilant and really understand what's happening. I hope this is a start. I am so proud to be hosting this show today, and I'm so grateful for your time. I'd like to introduce Kia Guarino. She is the executive director of Pro-Choice Washington, and it is our state's only agency focused solely on political and legislative advocacy for reproductive freedom in Washington State. Before we jump in, I just want to say, I've had a real hesitation to use this platform to support things I believe in politically, right? I work really hard to be kind of non-biased, but after June 24th, I just couldn't be unbiased anymore or stay quiet. And I really wanted to close out this season because the overturning of Roe v. Wade has been one of the biggest COVID pivots for our country that maybe has ever happened. So I was on a search to find somebody who could truly help this audience channel their anger into something productive. And my search led me to you, Kia. Your whole career has been in advocacy, and you joined Pro-Choice Washington in 2020. Mm-hmm. What a year to be alive.
Absolutely.
And so I will tell this story because I think it's amazing. I was sitting in my PJs at my counter digging through kind of who might be willing to come on the show to talk to me about this. And I cold called Kia, and I had a very lovely pitch for her voicemail all ready to go when she picked up her phone, which I mean,
very unusual, actually. I usually don't.
It just never happens. And so the serendipity of this whole thing and your graceful acceptance means so much to me. I cannot thank you enough for your time, and I cannot wait to dive into this conversation. You are more than qualified to speak on behalf of your 26,000 members of Pro-Choice Washington. If you could just give us a little tidbit of your background. I know you've done it 1,000 times, but just for people that don't know, I think your credentials are impressive and worth mentioning. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And thank you for having me here. I'm happy to have this conversation. Wish under better circumstances.
I know.
But so I do bring a long history of global health and international development in my career. I spent several years working around the world with a range of gender and family planning advocates, different age groups, different stakeholders, different industries, different countries. I worked for a while with Operation Smile, doing sort of on the ground engagement with activists and with medical staff and government officials for many years. Spent a couple years earning a dual master's with Johns Hopkins University in the international development policy and economic space, as well as the international health system space. And the purpose there was just to really learn a lot more about how all of these things come together to create health outcomes or health inequities across the world. And then after that, I spent several years working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on global advocacy for family planning and gender equity.
So talk to me a little bit about the definition of family planning. So you're going to have to be very patient because I'm going to ask you to explain things like I'm a kindergartner. So we are crystal clear on what we're talking about.
Absolutely. So family planning is a little bit of an outdated term, I'd say, but effectively it's an idea of how you decide if, when, or how to have a family.
Okay.
And so that usually includes contraceptives, but it can also include the full range of fertility treatments and things like egg freezing or considerations around adoption. So if you think about it in the wide range, it means anything to do with deciding if, when, or how to have a family.
Okay. And so tell me how that experience translated into you becoming an advocate for reproductive rights.
Yeah. So one of the realities of this moment, but in general, that drove me to this work is that abortion care fundamentally, but reproductive rights generally, is such a deciding factor in most socioeconomic and health outcomes in the world. And being part of the advocacy space in many countries around the world and in many communities, it became very clear that it continues to be sidelined repeatedly and pushed outside of a traditional healthcare conversation into a moral or political conversation, even though having access to family planning services and abortion care is a make or break in someone's ability to participate in society. And so coming to this job in the moment that I did, it was because I was working in these international settings, watching them advance family planning and abortion care while we rolled back actively. And I felt like this was a moment to turn this inward and look at home and really apply those skills to our local policies as we were losing them.
On a personal level, before we really get into this, I do want to ask you, how do you compartmentalize what I have to believe are really strong feelings about this? I'm having trouble and I don't work in this space, but tell me how you are mentally handling life right now.
Yeah. I mean, on some days it feels like, the emotional burden of a country and, the world in some ways. And in many ways, I think the way that I compartmentalize it is that we exist in a long arc, right? And to get here, we'll talk about this, I'm sure, took many, many years of action, taking steps to take away our rights. And just as much, we're on a long arc of progress, and we have to think about it in that way, because a lot of the efforts that have taken place to take away our rights over the last several years and several decades have been around the idea of overwhelming and creating exactly what that feeling is, which is hopelessness, helplessness, overwhelm, and to take away our effective action. So I have to remember that that's exactly what this is designed to do, and try not to give into it.
I think that point that you just made is so, again, enraging, but that the whole point is to create this sense of overwhelm. So over the arc of time, people will back down.
Yeah.
Like, we are living in that very real construct. And I honestly don't think I realized it until I started researching for this episode. And again, like, I have to admit, like, this is so embarrassing to say. I'm 44 years old and I had no idea. And I have to believe I'm not the only one.
You're not. Absolutely not.
That has had no idea. So, I mean, it's just so, it's so hard to wrap my brain around the fact that there is so much data that supports abortion access, lowering homicide rates, lowering maternal mortality rates. I mean, all of these things, there is hard data, and yet here we are working against all of that. So I do have kind of a structure to keep myself in line for this interview. So where I really want to start before we get too deeply into this is one of the things that Pro-Choice Washington is very good at is talking about abortion. There is a downloadable PDF that I will link to in my notes about how to talk about abortion. That is one of the most powerful things I have read in a really long time. And I want you to talk about it because, like we were saying, I am from the generation where, like, you did not say the word abortion. There are words associated with it, back alley, coat hanger, all of those things, which again were crafted to stigmatize abortion. And so one of the goals of your organization is to destigmatize it. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that you found it useful. The goal really is to take back the narrative around this. A lot of why we are where we are today is that we have allowed ourselves as a broad movement to be on our back foot and to sort of apologize and do exactly what you were referencing, which is sort of dance around abortion in a way that allowed it to continue to be stigmatized and sidelined as a moral issue, as opposed to a fundamental healthcare and socioeconomic issue, which it is. And the more that we avoid the term abortion, or the more that we say, rarely, or people don't want it, or only if, the more we create this space to allow for folks who are taking away our rights to say, see, it's problematic, or see, it's dangerous, see, it's violent. That's what we've been saying the whole time. And so this guide is really about giving people the tools, the very practical tools and background as to why you're hearing language change in this movement, which is, being unapologetic about the word abortion or the ways in which abortion may or may not be used at any time. We just, generally speaking, we support it. Not qualifying it anymore, not using terminology that is aligned with the sort of violent narrative of coat hanger or back alley, like you were indicating, being more gender inclusive, because that doesn't actually remove the fact that this is a woman's issue, but it recognizes that there is bias in our systems that makes it harder for some people to get care if we don't talk about it as both a women's and a broader gender inclusive issue.
There was just a viral video that went out, and I think it was Josh Hawley was grilling a doctor saying, well, so how you're saying it's a woman's issue. And I really watched that video and was like, oh my God, like, we do really need to broaden this conversation, because again, a part of this is, as Washington is a sanctuary state for abortion, being able, as people discussing it, to be able to say we need to broaden these rights for people. Okay, so let's talk about what words we need to use and what words we need to avoid in this conversation as I go forward, because let's use this as a teachable moment for Shannon Hall right now.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, to start off, use the word abortion always. Don't use euphemisms. Don't avoid it. Don't apologize. Don't qualify. Just abortion is healthcare, period. And that is it. It's important to talk about trimesters in pregnancy as opposed to late term or things that imply that there are medical realities that aren't there, like heartbeat or things like that, which when you get into the medical details of it, that's been used to sort of humanize an experience that isn't actually medically accurate.
And isn't the original Roe v. Wade, didn't they kind of create that trimester system within that lawsuit to kind of regulate it?
Yeah, it was basically a way to define a really undefinable sort of theoretical concept around what is life. And I think that is a really interesting part of this conversation. And, you know, in Alito referenced saying that, you know, this was never mentioned in the history of our country. It's not, you know, core to our country's beliefs. But if you look back in the time frame of the Constitution, they refer to it as the quickening, which is sort of like third trimester. And so there is this sort of lack of clarity around that definition that's been around for a long time. And so by saying late term or things like that, we create a value judgment to whatever time frame, you know, that isn't really medically aligned with life or not life.
So one thing that I found really interesting also is the term pro-choice and pro-life, because as you point out, the term pro-life is directly from an anti-abortion playbook. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So if we allow the anti-abortion movement to call themselves pro-life, it's implying that saving people's lives by allowing them to get a necessary healthcare procedure is somehow less valuable. And the reality is that abortion saves a lot more lives. And we know this from the data that you were referencing earlier. It is about 300 times more dangerous than an abortion to go through a pregnancy, especially for people of color in this country. And so by saying we're just the choice and they are life, we allow them to create a distinction that isn't actually of value, of an accurate representation of the distinctions between our movement.
I think that's another thing that just sort of stuns me as you sit here and think about it. And this irony that pro-life isn't that at all is pretty striking. And that we have all bought into this vernacular in our everyday life. Every day it is something that we talk about. And I am so irritated that I didn't even realize the subtle brainwashing, for lack of a better term.
Absolutely. I mean, the opposite of pro-life is like when you think about language, right? We've created a space where that is somehow, we've allowed ourselves to be defined as that. And when you see lawmakers in different states around the country right now blocking the ability to get an abortion, even if it saves the woman's life, like how can you say that's a life movement, right? It's not. And you're right. We've been sitting here for decades allowing that to be a distinction. And so we just need to stop that.
I think with, I mean, again, this is so timely because the New York Times article just came out about the woman in Texas who couldn't get a DNC, which, I mean, as a middle-aged woman now, I know a lot of people who have benefited from those. I know a lot of people who have miscarried. I know a lot of people who have frozen embryos. These are not far from any of us. These critical moral decisions that are now going to be brought to the state for women to deal with. It's terrifying, but I also think that expanding the term abortion to mean these other things is mission critical.
Yeah, I think that you nailed it. I think, for a long time in that apology space, abortion, even in the progressive movement, was framed as this like charity issue, right? Like the poor young woman who doesn't want to have a kid, or the young woman who wants to have a career instead, right? Which of course are valid stories, and sure, but that is not the entire story by any means. And the scale of risk based on what will happen around miscarriages, ectopic pregnancies, other issues around fertility. I mean, we've opened up a door that was somehow not seen as part of abortion healthcare that is now at serious risk, and it will impact a significant
here
portion of
with Cassie
women,
Walker Johnson,
even if they don't
with Johnson
imagine
Walker,
that they'll
with
ever
Windermere.
choose an abortion, right? That's not
First question I
necessarily
have for you, Cassie.
what this is
if
about,
a
which is
seller
also
wants
why
to maximize their return on investment, what
representation for
should
our own
they be
movement,
focused on?
Because it's
the most important thing that you can
choice.
focus on is flooring,
Well, I think
lighting,
about, you know, I am
painting,
past
and yard
my
cleanup.
childbearing
Those are
years
the
now,
first four
but I think
items that we
about,
always go to,
you know, my daughter's
to really
7.
help a client update
So
with a way
what's
that
gonna
gives the house a
happen
real sparkle. And
in
then from
her
there, if
in
they
the
want to do
next
further
20
investment, we
years
always
as she
recommend focusing on
moves forward in
kitchens
life
and bathrooms. Those are the first two things that make the biggest
with,
impression
you know,
when somebody's
God
coming to
forbid
look at their
something
home,
happened
and
late in her
therefore you'll get a
pregnancy.
higher
I mean, I think
return
we've
on
all
investment.
known somebody
Cassie,
like
do
that
you give people
also,
advice on
without
these
the
4 ways to make their home
ability to
sparkle?
really
Not only do we give advice,
go
but we
to
help
a
manage
doctor
it. We
for
bring the
help. That is
vendors. We offer full
absolutely
concierge
a
service so that we can help
proposition.
you get the best bang for your buck.
You all can
And so
find Cassie
normalizing
at
this word abortion to
johnsonandwalker.com.
mean all of these other things and to be just reproductive health care is so, so powerful. And there are all sorts of, you know, words to avoid also that I thought were amazing. Avoid the use of women, women's rights, all of these things, taking the gender out of it too. I don't think I fully understood the importance of that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the clip that you referenced is a really good job of this. We're in a moment where this has been sidelined as sort of a niche feminist issue, as opposed to an issue that impacts absolutely everyone. And at the same time, there are folks who don't identify as women who have the ability to become pregnant. And there are people who identify as women who can't get pregnant. And so what we're actually talking about, when you think about it from the healthcare space, is abortion as a healthcare service, which impacts groups of people that can get pregnant. Right. So it's, again, moving it out of this sort of moral sidelined issue and into a reality that this is abortion care. And if we can say something that will allow certain groups of people to get better healthcare or feel safer in getting that healthcare, why wouldn't we do that? Right. This is about women's rights, but it's also about the right for anybody who can get pregnant to have a safe pregnancy or not have a pregnancy. And so speaking about it in a more inclusive way is how we grow this movement.
There are also examples of conversations yesterday. I'm reading as I'm talking. There are examples of conversations on here on this PDF that are fascinating, and actually one that I just had with somebody, and I was listening to a podcast yesterday and they kept saying pregnant people instead of women. I get the need for inclusive language, but are we not allowed to say women anymore? And I was like, oh my God, I've had this conversation and I didn't know how to talk about it, but this really does kind of put the words to that conversation. So thank you for that.
And it still is a women's issue, right? It's still women's rights as well. It's
absolutely.
It's an
and it's not threatening to women's rights. I think that's kind of what we have to get past.
Justice is not a zero-sum game. And if we think that way, we are also playing into the anti-everything narrative, right? It's not a zero-sum game. We can be collectively better.
I think that is, for me, the biggest like aha out of this, because you don't really think about trans men being able to get pregnant and maybe that's not what they want. And so it does, the inclusivity of it to me is important, and I can see that in a totally different way now. So thank you for being willing to talk about it, because I think it's a pretty like mind-bending conversation for a lot of us, but this does clarify it. So
I'm glad.
Thank you.
Of course.
Hi friends, this is Cassie with Johnson & Walker Windermere. Jeremy and I just wanted to take a moment to thank you, the listeners, for supporting Shannon's podcast, for opening your minds and your hearts to some truly amazing stories, including mine. We've been honored to sponsor season 4 right in front of my face, listening to so many beautiful recaps about pivoting in COVID. From rebuilding a Pilates studio to managing screen time, we find we walk away from each podcast learning something new. We're honored to sponsor season 4, and we can't wait to hear what Shannon has in store for us next. Have a great summer.
I want to talk about something now that we've normalized the word abortion. So many people in your field seem to not have been surprised that Roe v. Wade was overturned. So knowing that we've all kind of fallen for this anti-abortion propaganda for so long, now that I realize I've fallen for it, I'm super mad. But I do feel like, oh my God, why didn't we see this coming? So can you talk a little bit about why Roe v. Wade was so precarious and why we should have maybe been a little bit more prepared for this?
I think hopefully what we'll see from this is something that happened 50 years ago, which is really how long this effort has been to overturn Roe v. Wade. The second it was implemented, and around the time of women's sexual liberation, there has been a movement to bring women back into the home. And if you actually look at some of the lawmakers, they've said that in the last couple of weeks, that this is about bringing women back into the home. So this agenda is actually very specific. It's not necessarily about abortion. It's about reclaiming power from groups of people who have been gaining power over the last 50 years.
Are those real words?
Those are real words. There was a lawmaker, I will butcher the state, I think it was Utah, but don't quote me on that one. But a lawmaker who recently said in the last couple of months that they didn't support funding childcare services because anything that encourages women to leave the home, and this was in response to an abortion ban, is not good, effectively. And so what we've been seeing for 50 years is a backlash to growth and power for women in the society. And we hear that with the increase of the number of women going to college, being in the workplace, all those things. There has been a pretty steady backlash.
It's really tough for me to believe that it's so baseline that this is about stripping women of power. But it does seem like that's what it is. Like, can we just call it what it is?
Yeah, I think we need to be pretty upfront about, it's not just women, it's all of the movements around removing voting rights, removing gender care, removing women's health care, removing reproductive care. All of that is for the same agenda, which is removing power from other groups, quote unquote. And so, yes, it's been part of that agenda for a really long time. And what we need to learn as a progressive movement is how they did this, right? So, yes, there has been this total control of the narrative that we've been subjected to that allowed folks to moralize a healthcare issue to the extent that we didn't even see this coming. Many people didn't see this coming. Then there was also very committed long-term actions at the local level. And it was very under the radar, very well funded, and very specifically targeting the overturning of Roe. And so things like Senate Bill 8, which is in Texas, which was one of the first that we started to see roll out. Now we have many, many more. That was about citizen vigilantism, a way to sidestep constitutional protections of abortion rights. That was actually a 15-year process that was done very strategically.
But I think we need to learn from this in the state of Washington, which is another thing. Like This is a great segue, actually, because where I kind of want to go here is I feel like we're very spoiled in Washington. We are a sanctuary state. We think that nothing can happen where our, abortion laws are codified, all of this stuff, but it really is not that way.
No.
And I do think that where progressives fall is exactly what you said in another podcast interview that you gave. But I want to talk about it here because it is about that long arc. And progressives tend to get really, really mad, really, really fast. And then there's a march. And then we're like, well, that didn't do anything. And it's like this instant gratification thing.
Yep.
Is that what you're saying, kind of?
Yeah. I think, yes, to both of those points, we are lucky to be in a state with abortion protections. And we have to be willing to recognize that the goal is a federal abortion ban. And if we don't participate in the democratic process, as imperfect as it is, we cede that power entirely. And it's very easy when we're in a progressive state to say, that's not possible. The same way we sort of thought about Roe, like, no way, that won't happen.
It'll never happen here.
Yeah, we are fine.
Yep, we're
it's
a blue
fine.
state.
We're
it's
blue.
Fine.
First of all, we're not that blue. Second of all, if you actually pay attention to the local elections, which we really need to start doing, we're coming up to November where we have almost 90% of our legislation up for re-election. And we have seen a significant uptick in far-right candidates at all levels of government gaining momentum in this moment as progressives burn themselves out, step back, find themselves sort of targeting our own instead of thinking about, okay, this isn't going to be an overnight thing. We can't expect it to be. But what it does mean is that we have to be willing to participate in this system still, even an imperfect system, so that we don't give up all of our power. And so, yeah, I mean, we are at risk in Washington to lose it. We're only as secure as our state legislature. And if we lose at the federal level, a federal abortion ban has already been introduced.
But I think this is what we have to keep in the back of our minds as citizens everywhere. I mean, this podcast has a national and a global listenership. It is mostly on the coasts where there are sanctuary states. Like finds like, right? So I cannot stress enough the importance of voting. And it sounds so dumb, but just today, right before you got here, I got my mail and I got my voter's pamphlet.
Wonderful.
And I have interviewed Dr. Leila Rave on this podcast. She's running for state representative spot in District 46, where I live. She is a pediatrician, and she was here the day that the news leaked. That this was going to be overturned before it happened. So her phone was blowing up as we were recording. And just like, politics aside, kind of on a female to female level, we looked at each other and we're like, this is happening. In our generation, we both have daughters, and it seems so silly to just keep saying vote, but that really is what needs to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem silly. And I fully recognize in saying vote that the system has failed many of us, and particularly people of color and historically marginalized folks have been failed by our systems. And yet the best way for us to fully cede our power is by stepping back. We haven't lost our power entirely. That is the objective, but we still have it. And it feels like such a gut punch because it was. But if we give up, if we don't participate even in an imperfect system, then we don't have a chance to bring this back. And if you look around the world, there are examples of people bringing their countries back from these sort of edge points, right? And it's going to require a lot of focus on what it actually requires for us to get back to a place where rights are protected.
So what you're saying is all the 18-year-olds, all of the college kids, we have the University of Washington literally almost in my backyard. It is time to mobilize and actually show up, because I think it is almost looked at as an act of defiance to not vote.
Yes.
But really, you are just giving up.
Yes. I mean, right now we're seeing the same groups that have been rolling back abortion rights, have been rolling back gender affirming care, were part of January 6th. They're all the same groups. And at the same time, they're also passing laws that take away voting rights from groups that have been historically marginalized. So why would we, as an act of defiance, do exactly what they're working to accomplish? Why would we cede our power in that way when right now, actually, an act of defiance is voting? And it doesn't feel that way. And I totally understand the feeling of, well, we voted, in 2020 with all our hearts, and we don't see the results that we want. Roe was still overturned. That was actually because not enough people voted in 2017. And in previous, we think about this in immediacy terms, but if you look again at our arc, our history, if we think of our moment as a history book, you could see this coming for a very long time, retrospectively.
Right.
But that also means there's a lot of the story unwritten. And if we hand it over, it's over. And, we still have pretty dismal voter turnout rates.
It's terrible. It's embarrassing.
So, yeah, when people say, well, what's the point of voting? It's like, well, we actually don't, if you think about it holistically.
Well, and also, we do live in a bubble. We live in an in King County, right? I will speak to in King County, we are this little bubble where there's a ton of money, a ton of privilege, and we think that we will maintain that forever. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, because for me, as a middle-class white woman with a middle-class white daughter, I look at it and I'm like, I've got money to fly my daughter to get anywhere. For me specifically, this might not actually be that huge of a problem. It's not me that I want to fight for. It is everybody else who this will touch, right? And I think that's really important to say. Like, even if you think it's not going to affect you, there are millions of families out there who need this help, who need these laws supported, who need these rights protected.
Yeah. And I think another sort of myth that we need to change too is yes, you're fully right. That's true. And the train that's coming at us from a healthcare and socioeconomic crisis perspective with the loss of abortion rights will impact us in a very different way. And I think that's
state of Washington, you mean?
Yeah, as individuals, even with privilege, right?
Yep.
And I think that for male listeners, I think that's a really important point, because even now I have folks like, yeah, it's bad, but and I think what we all need to recognize as individuals across the gender spectrum is this impacts every single person in terms of your broader livelihood, right? And even the way that the abortion rights were overturned in the language, it's such a classic story of, well, this one thing leads to then the other thing leads to then the other thing. So even if you don't think this particular issue impacts you today, guess what this line leads to if we don't stand up, right? And yes, absolutely, we could always pay to get abortion care. Yep. That was true even in the 60s, right? That is absolutely true.
Yes, these senators.
Yes, they will
continue to find ways.
Absolutely. There will be ways, and abortion is a lot safer now than it was then with abortion pills and things like that. There will be safe options for people with privilege. And yet we're talking about sitting within a country that is willing to roll back such a massive amount of basic civil right and human right protections that will lead to an economic crisis. So, even as individuals, we'll feel it.
I want to talk for a second about something you just said about abortion being safe, because I think this is another huge stigma and changing the way that we think about it. There's a line, again, in this amazing handout that says abortion is safer than getting a wisdom tooth pulled.
Yeah.
And I think that perspective is really important.
Yeah. So, in the pre-Roe era, you'll hear a lot of stories, really valid, really traumatic stories of what it was like to have to try to get an abortion in that setting where it was illegal. And it's not to say that a lot of people will not experience really bad medical outcomes and a loss of life with the end of Roe v. Wade. That's all true. What is different is the idea of that, really violent back alley imagery. That doesn't have to exist now because of medication abortion. And we have been doing a lot of work as activists across the country, making it easier to access the pill form of abortion care, which can be provided up to 10 weeks. It is safer than most over-the-counter drugs, safer than Tylenol, repeatedly shown it's something that people can do in the privacy of their home, without the risks associated with a lot of that really negative, violent imagery. And I think making sure people realize that there are safe options and that we're working to make sure that that remains available really can counter, again, that idea that this is some sort of horrible, violent experience.
Right.
And that is not to say that those stories were invalid. There were a lot of harmful things that happened. And yet today we have these safe options.
And I think, at least for the state of Washington, working to get access for these safe options for the groups that don't have equitable access is another thing to stay focused on as we are voting. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Access, just because, and this is a truth with the Roe too, just because there is legal protection does not mean people get care. And in some ways, if there is one, the silver lining of Roe being overturned was that revealed how bad it was already. So this, in many, many states where we're seeing these bans, abortion was effectively banned. It was just sort of hidden by the idea that we had these federal protections.
Interesting.
And so, being able to sort of pull the curtain in some ways, we actually start to see what inequity looks like. Even in a place like Washington, we can get it. Absolutely. King County, with resources, going to non-Catholic hospitals, going to places where you can get that care. Yep. But that's not true in a lot of the state for either, financial reasons, geographic reasons, discriminatory reasons. All these things make it so that we still have a lot of work to do, even if we maintain basic protections here in Washington.
That the New York Times article that I referenced, the last paragraph was a woman saying, my husband and I are afraid to even continue trying to have a family in the state of Texas because of what they went through, just trying to get a DNC for, it was not even an implanted fetus.
Yeah.
And so you look at these outcomes for people and the devastation that will come down. And I was listening to the Daily about the 4 abortion clinics the day after Roe v. Wade was overturned. And something struck me so much. One of the nurses was saying, we don't talk about what a place of joy this actually is. Also, we have saved lives here. We have guaranteed futures. This isn't a place of sorrow all the time for many families.
Yeah, I think that is such a good point. And again, it plays into that idea that it's always a horrible thing. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people, it has given them freedom, either from a dangerous relationship or a pathway that they didn't feel like could get off of, or opened up a possibility to have, a future that is of their own design. I think it can be a really joyful thing. And there is a lot of camaraderie within clinics, right? Like there's a really beautiful space of providing women and people who don't want to maintain pregnancy an opportunity to do so. And yeah, there are these really sad, horrific stories. And like you said, there's joy. And that's why it's such a nuanced issue that has been, I would say, unfairly defined for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I personally, I've talked about this on the podcast before. I feel almost embarrassed at how easy my pregnancies were. So I have not experienced, miscarriage or, any other type of pregnancy ending. But in my lifetime, I have been called on by friends to take them to get an abortion. I am Catholic. I went to a Catholic high school and a Catholic college. And in college, there was a situation by a woman I know and she had asked me to take her in. And I was pretty torn. I was really torn up about it. Not even for myself in any way, but seeing kind of the before and after of this person's life. And I talked to my campus minister from my old high school because I said, I'm going to do it, but can you kind of walk me through it? And he just said, Shannon, our place as human beings is never, ever to judge the action. Your job as a human being on this earth, as a person of faith, is to support, do what you need to do, be that person's friend, and come at it from a totally non-judgmental space. And that has stuck with me my entire life. And that is why I have such a difficult time talking about this, because that was the frame that I took it in. Do I know what my decisions would be? Absolutely, I don't. I can't put myself into that chair any more than I could know what it was like to be a Republican senator. But I do know that from this non-judgmental position, that is how I want to move forward thinking about this issue. And it's not always easy, but conversations like this really help me change my thinking around this whole issue. And so again, I thank you for being a sounding board. And it brings me in to what I want to end our conversation with, because I want to be respectful of your time. Kia, please tell us what to do. Please tell us what to do, because I feel so powerless. I mean, this podcast is the only thing that I have to offer, but I don't want to fall into this trap of inaction, because I see it happening and I feel it happening already, and I don't want to fall for it. So tell us what we can do.
Yeah. And I think we talked a bit about it already throughout this podcast, but this isn't actually a bad way to exercise that power. I think having open conversations, owning our growth in this, owning our own discomfort and how we've sort of changed our approach to this issue publicly is actually a really powerful way to make change and keep this going, right? To not let this be this one quick burnout action period, but just continue having these conversations. And, not everybody has to be on a platform like this one, but it can be just one-on-one conversations. It can be you thinking through your own questions and then looking at these resources to learn, okay, wait, what am I actually feeling here? Is that my own, or is this something I learned over the years? How can I unlearn it? How can I start to change this narrative? So just conversations, speaking about this openly. The second one is voting. We've talked about that a lot too, but really, truly, I cannot overemphasize how important the 2022 and 2023 elections are for then deciding how we want to shape our future, right? It's not to say that we should lose our vision of pushing for the most progressive versions of our country, but we also need to be able to have a country to do that with and to be able to protect places like Washington where we have sanctuary states for as long as possible. And then I would say the third piece is, donating or taking action as an individual volunteer. And one of the things that we're seeing a lot is a desire for people to either be conduits for others. So, holding them in their home, driving them to a clinic, whatever that might be, and not knowing where to put their dollars. And so one of the ways that we really direct people, those two places to action, is abortion funds. And folks are hearing a little bit more about this now, but abortion funds have been around for decades, and they effectively play that role, which is finding people who need care, getting them to that care, getting them the resources, navigating the systems. And it's usually people who have been facing barriers to care. This has now become an incredibly essential role when we're also talking about cross-state at a much higher level. We're expecting 400% almost increase of patients coming to Washington from out of state now.
I mean, 400%.
Mm-hmm. We're already seeing
What are those numbers now? Do you know off the top of your head?
No, I don't know. All I know anecdotally is that we've seen a significant uptick already. And so rather than reinventing the wheel and, trying to do it on your own, especially in a place where there's a lot of legal gray area right now with the way that states are writing their laws, I highly encourage people to donate to abortion funds and to volunteer with or through abortion funds if you want to help people get the care that they need, because just for your own safety, for the patient's safety, highly encourage people to do that. And that's incredibly impactful.
I think one of the topics of conversation in that daily podcast was saying that clinics have now become glorified travel agencies.
Yeah.
Because they will try to find care, and I will be donating to those funds. I didn't actually know that those existed. Yeah,
a lot of people didn't. And I think that is one of the nice, silver lining, if there is one of this, is that people are starting to see the system that's been in place trying to protect these rights and get people care in these systems that were already imperfect and were deeply under-resourced and sort of considered really niche, sidelined areas, right? Like you're considered a little bit extreme if you do abortion advocacy, right? And that has to change too, because really these systems have been in place. They've been working really hard to try to hold the line, but now resourcing these groups is a really important way for us to overcome some of the challenges that we're seeing now in a safer way for everybody.
I wonder if violence against people that are needing reproductive care and providers is going to uptick also. Is anybody seeing any of that anecdotally?
Yes, it's already been pretty significant. It actually started in 2017-ish, is a pretty rapid uptick in harassment, particularly in Washington on the eastern side of the Cascades. But definitely over the last couple of years and absolutely over the last couple of months, we've seen a very emboldened group of individuals, including to our own organization, that feel entitled to be incredibly violent in their language, in their approach towards people who are seeking care, and, protecting providers and protecting patients, both in terms of physical safety, but also digital safety, is a really big part of the work that we're trying to do now. And there's a lot of digital surveillance and use of personal data that, is a big topic of conversation now in a way that it wasn't really before, because there are concrete and physical consequences. And so the uptick has been significant and concerning.
Do you feel vulnerable? I mean, you are a leader of a pretty, openly pro-healthcare organization.
Yeah, that was a conversation my husband and I had before I took this job in the US, right? It's a very different situation to be in the US, be at home. And the answer is yes, not nearly as much as providers. I think we live in a place, in a time, I should say. We live in a time when people feel validated to spew violence and hate and to be capable of that in a way that I think wasn't the case for a long time. And so we've absolutely seen much more violent language come towards us as activists, but we aren't nearly the most at risk. And the folks I worry about the most are patients and providers who are just trying to provide or seek life-saving care.
I think it is such a barrier, this emboldened feeling. I put out a reel on Instagram today saying I was interviewing you, and I literally, as I hit post, I was like, oh, buckle your seatbelt, because, I even talked to my husband about it. I'm like, this is going out into the world now. But I've sort of made the choice to not be scared about it anymore, because it doesn't ultimately matter to me to be on the receiving end of that.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. It matters more that people have the right to a safe abortion.
Yeah, I think the beauty again of this moment is that it is undeniable. The data shows very clearly that the majority movement is with abortion care. And the majority of people in this country, in the state, believe that people deserve this care. There's a lot of little sub definitions about what or how, but it is a vast majority of this country and the state. And it's been hidden. Right. Because we have been told to be afraid. We have been told it's extreme, that, you can't be taken seriously if you work on a niche feminist issue like this, which is wild when you really think about it as a basic fundamental healthcare. And again, we sort of allowed that space to take place.
Yes. I mean, I remember in Portland, growing up in Portland, there was an abortion clinic on a major arterial going downtown. Every single time you drove by, there were protesters out front. And it was usually the same three people. Like, we all knew them. But it was still in the back of my mind all the time. Like, if that's ever me, that's what I have to go through.
Yeah. And imagine doing that every day for your job. And the sad reality is that the folks who... most folks who are spewing this vitriol or who are showing up and harming people in their own spaces actually have the same fundamental value that we're talking about, which is life, right? Like that it's such, likewise, as we have been misled over years, so have these folks in terms of what it actually means to be fighting for a person's life. And again, not everybody has that perspective, right? We know there's an agenda to just have women back in the home as well. Yeah. But for many folks who really believe that this is what they're working towards, it's just such a sad state of affairs that we have this fundamental value alignment and yet are sitting in such different places. And it's resulting in real harm.
I think it's the tangibleness of the harm. Is that a word? Tangibleness?
Yes. I think so.
It's just so out there, and it's so clear and so data supported that it really, I think it bears repeating that this is, despite the data, despite the majority thinking that this is care that we really should have in this country, despite all of those things, the baseline is getting women back in the home. Mm-hmm. For conservatives. That's sort of and I think when you break it down to that being the baseline issue, for me personally, it's a little bit easier to be like, oh.
Right. It makes more sense a little bit, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't.
It doesn't, but the actions do.
But the actions make sense. And so if we're going to have this slow burn and the arc like you talk about, which I think is so true, then we really have to remember that that is the goal. It's already out there. There's already a federal abortion ban that has been introduced, and we need to like wake up.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really about taking away power from people who've been gaining power, right? Like that is all of those agendas really align. And I've said this a couple of times because I want our movement to really see it as that, it's around taking the power away from people who have gained it over the last 50 years. And that includes bringing women back in the home. And yes, as horrible, as painful as it is to sit with that and to be like, to think about what a federal abortion ban could mean for us as individuals, because again, if you're in your fertility years, it could absolutely impact you.
Yeah.
And, but if we don't, if we choose to continue to believe that that's not possible, we miss our window. And I think that is that whole voting conversation. This is our window. And it's actually a very powerful window. Again, as painful as it can be to say, vote, 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 do it. I think because we have to believe that that is the approach.
Yeah. And if anybody out there is listening, if you have a child who's a senior in high school or in college, please let them listen to this, because the power of that voice, the act of defiance, is the vote. And I think we really need to turn that around. I think people got really disillusioned with the last two presidential elections and thought it doesn't matter, but it does. And on the state level, it matters a whole lot right now.
Yeah.
So Kia, I'm going to look to you to provide me a list of places where we can donate. These
Absolutely.
Abortion funds are incredibly valuable to the people that need them, and they need our support. I'm going to link to Pro-Choice Washington. I am now a member of
Welcome.
all of the things.
We're glad to have you.
And the most powerful thing I do think that we can put out there are conversations like this. So I cannot thank you enough for coming into this with a willingness to take it down to the baseline. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Kia, your hopeful arc gave me some hope of my own that I really need to cling to. Thank you so much for your time and also for your work. Links to everything we talked about will be on my blog and in my show notes. So please use your dollars and donate, but more importantly, use your vote. I want to pause now in complete gratitude for the experience of doing this podcast. I want to start by saying thank you to the 11 individuals that gave their time to talk about their COVID pivots and for inspiring me in my daily life. Christy Lord, Lindsay Droz, Nathalia Gorish, Emily Churkin, Dr. Leilach Rave, Aaron Skipley, Dr. Ashwin Rao, Aaron Quick, Zach Brittle, and Cassie Walker-Johnson, and Kia Guarino. Gratitude is not enough. Your honesty, guidance, and inspiration will stay personally with me forever, and it's touched so many in this audience. To my sponsors, Jeremy and Cassie Johnson, there is no way to quantify a friendship. Your support of this passion project and of me personally means more than you'll ever realize. Your texts of encouragement and support have kept me moving forward. Truly, I am so appreciative. Jason Best from Three Lovers edits my podcast and has gracefully handled my schedule and has never let me down. Jason, I appreciate your talent, and you are the reason this show sounds so incredible. Thank you. And most of all, to you listeners, thank you for sticking by a sometimes unpredictable release schedule to listen to these stories. Thank you for your engagement on social media, for the emails, and for the support of the people that have been on this show. There have been so many times I've questioned why I'm doing this. It's a time-consuming hobby. But then I'll see someone out and about who will pull me aside and tell me that an episode hit their heart, and it makes it all worth it. Because that's the point, isn't it? To become a community, to feel less alone, to see the good, speak some truth, and keep learning from each other's experience. I have gotten real existential these last few weeks, and the only thing that we have is each other. That's the point of this world on fire. We are the point. We are the only ones who can pull each other out of this. And this is my commitment, to continue shining a light on the good and helpful things that I see. I want to share with you a conversation I had with my cousin. She's also trying to build a business while being a full-time mother, wife, and friend. And I was sharing with her that I felt really frustrated about this podcast. On one hand, I'm incredibly proud of the work that I'm doing, but I'm not sure what to do next because as an ambitious person, I always want things to be bigger and better. She looked at me and she said, "Why can't this just be enough? Your stories are great. So many people have learned from your guests. Why does it always have to be more for us?" And that one sentence realigned my thinking so much. As I move forward, I'm trying just to let the effort and the result be enough and not ruin it with my ambition. So that's my challenge for you during this space where I'm trying to figure out season 5. Can we all just try to let what is be enough? It's really hard, but I'm going to do my best, and I challenge you to try as well. I remain committed to asking questions about things I don't know from people I trust that can give me the answer, whether I like it or not. So please stick with me. There will be a season 5. Believe me, I have no shortage of big things happening right in front of my face.